With the release of Resident Evil 7 in 2017, Capcom's RE engine has served as the core technical foundation for nearly all of the company's releases. While the engine has shown clear limitations in large-scale open-world titles such as Monster Hunter Wilds at launch and Dragon's Dogma 2, it truly excels in more contained linear experiences. That strength is on full display with the new Resident Evil Requiem. The game plays directly to the RE engine's advantages, delivering some of the best visuals of this generation, along with generally consistent and smooth performance. And I say generally because there are some rare shader compilation stutters that I noticed during my first 4 to 5 hours with the game. Like this one here, where turning on the lighter for the first time triggers a small compilation hitch. But these are really rare and hard to notice, and overall the game ran exceptionally well with stable performance and consistent frame times. Beyond these occasional shader hitches, there are also few bugs and image quality issues that we'll discuss as we analyze how each setting scales and how it impacts both performance and visuals. So without any further ado, let's get started.
Excuse me.
Let's kick off with upscaling and image quality. Before examining the upscalers, there is an image quality issue worth calling out. The game applies a forced, overly aggressive film grain effect that cannot be disabled and negatively impacts the image clarity. Thankfully, there is a mod that removes this effect entirely, resulting in a much cleaner image as you can see here. So if this grain is bothering you, I highly recommend installing this mod. Now, when it comes to the upscalers, Resident Evil Requiem supports the DLSS 4 transformer model with preset K along with FSR1 and FSR3, and unfortunately there is no XCSS support. And since I don't have access to FSR4, there isn't much to talk about here. As expected, DLSS4 with preset K dominates in image quality over FSR3 and FSR1. FSR1 does run faster than DLSS and FSR3, but as a simple spatial upscaler, even when paired with GAA, it fails to produce a clean or stable image. DLSS is not free from issues though. As we've discussed in many videos, DLSS4 struggles when dealing with volumetric effects. In motion, these elements show visible breakup and artifacts, and this is more noticeable in RE Requiem, as the game relies heavily on volumetric lighting and effects. And as you can see here, FSR3 and FSR1 do not exhibit this particular problem. This leads us to DLSS 4.5 with preset L and M, which show better results than DLSS 4 preset K when dealing with volumetrics. However, when it comes to ray tracing, DLSS 4.5 presets increase the amount of noise and flickering and archy reflections and lighting. As for the performance cost of DLSS 4.5 on the 4070 Super, there is around an 8% hit with preset M and 13% with preset L. On the 3060 Ti, even with quality mode for DLSS 4 and balance for DLSS 4.5, preset M costs 21% while preset L is 30% slower than preset K. Resident Evil Requiem comes with ray tracing support. And for the first time in an RE engine game, we also have full patch tracing. Ray tracing improves the game's visuals over the already good-looking standard raster lighting, covering both diffused and specular lighting or reflections. But patch tracing takes the visuals to another level by delivering more realistic reflections and more accurate colored light bleeding. It also affects direct lighting and replaces the game's shadow maps with more accurate patch traced shadows. But despite these visual improvements, there are several issues with the current implementations. The ray tracing denoiser Capcom uses is weak and introduces a lot of flickering and boiling, as you can see here. Patch tracing relies on DLSS ray reconstruction, but this solution is not flawless either, and can introduce noticeable artifacts, especially when using upscaling. Ray reconstruction also softens the image compared to DLSS preset K on the ray tracing or raster side. Here you can clearly see that the patch tracing output appears blurrier than the other options. But these are not the only issues. In many areas, ray tracing seems to stop functioning entirely. Like here, patch tracing is working, but there is no visual or performance difference between off and high ray tracing. And I also encountered this on the 4070 Super at the beginning of Leon's section. The last issue I want to highlight is related to the NVIDIA drivers. There are many reports from owners of 40 series GPUs that the latest drivers cause a performance regression when using path tracing. I have tested this on the 4070 Super between version 576.88 from June 2025 and the newer 591.86. And there is a performance improvement with the older driver, but it's not that significant. What stands out more is that the GPU does not draw as much power with the newer driver compared to the old one. Now, there is a new driver that released yesterday, but it behaves the same as 591.86. So generally, if you have a higher power 40 series GPU and you are using path tracing, I recommend rolling back to the older driver from June 2025, as you might get a significant uplift in path tracing performance. Speaking of performance, path tracing is extremely demanding on both VRAM and frame rate, especially when running near maxed out settings. But that's not what we're doing here. The goal is to tune the settings and find the best configuration for ray tracing on a GPU like the 36C Ti and path tracing on the 4070 Super. So let's start with hair strands. Enabling this option replaces the simple hair card system with a strand-based solution that renders individual strands and allows them to interact naturally with lighting and shadows as shown here. This applies not only to the playable characters but also to other main NPCs like Grace's mother in this scene. In normal gameplay, this feature carries about a 9% performance cost and also increases VRAM usage noticeably. And interestingly, even when playing in first person, hair strands still takes a portion of VRAM without affecting performance. So if you are limited on VRAM and playing in first person, I recommend leaving hair strands off. Otherwise, it's worth keeping enabled. Moving on to texture quality. Now in this game, VRAM usage varies significantly depending on the area. At the beginning of the game, normal texture quality looks doable on an 8GB GPU, but later in Raccoon City, normal pushes VRAM very close to its limit. And when doing runs in this area between the texture options, we can see noticeable frame time variations with both normal and high, unlike low. Because of this, if you have an 8GB GPU, I recommend keeping textures at low. Next, we have texture filter quality. As usual, this one has a noticeable visual impact, but barely affects performance, so you can leave it at high anisotropic x16. Let's move on to mesh quality. This setting adjusts the geometric and polygonal detail of objects, characters, and enemies. With the standard option, many of these elements appear more rounded and better defined. Performance-wise, at first glance, this setting looks like it doesn't cost much, even in an area like this. However, in areas with higher geometric complexity like here in Raccoon City, the cost becomes noticeably higher, and the frame time graph on standard is less stable than on low. Because of this, I recommend keeping mesh quality at low. Moving on to screen space reflections. When ray tracing is disabled, the game falls back to a combination of cube maps and SSR. But SSR remains a weak point for the RE engine, and it still is not handled correctly. In this game, it's extremely noisy, and in my opinion, it hurts the visual more than it helps. Despite all that, it's still surprisingly demanding. It can cost up to 13%. Therefore, I recommend keeping screen space reflections disabled. Next, we have subsurface scattering. This setting controls how light interacts with and penetrates character skin. Here, low looks inaccurate as it hides a lot of fine details such as wrinkles. Switching to high restores those details and, in my opinion, looks noticeably better. Performance-wise, as usual, subsurface scattering is not that expensive, so I recommend keeping it at high. Let's move on to particle lighting. This setting enables dust particles in the air near the flashlight and other artificial light sources. In terms of performance, it doesn't appear to have any noticeable impact, so I recommend keeping it enabled. Moving on to volumetric fog resolution. This setting controls the quality of the game's volumetric lighting and effects. At higher levels, these elements appear more defined and show fewer breakups. Performance-wise, there is about a 3% cost when moving from lowest to normal and 7% when going to high. So for this one, I recommend low or normal. Next, we have shadow quality. This setting affects the resolution and precision of the game's shadow maps. And with the higher options, you get smoother, more complete, and more stable shadows. Performance-wise, shadows are not particularly expensive in this game, but this setting has a major impact on VRAM usage. And Max in particular can increase it by more than 1 gigabyte. In areas where VRAM usage is already high, even on the lower options, Max shadows can introduce heavier performance drops and inconsistent frame times. That's why I recommend keeping shadow quality at normal or high. Let's move on to contact shadows. When enabled, this setting fills in some of the gaps left by the shadow maps and adds shadow detail to smaller objects, vegetation, and other fine geometry. These shadows are very cheap to render and have no noticeable impact on performance, so I recommend keeping them enabled. Moving on to ambient occlusion, the game seems to use two different techniques depending on the option. Low looks like standard SSAO, while the higher options might be using something closer to HPAO. Visually, normal and high offer better coverage, but they tend to overshade the scene and can introduce dark halos around certain objects. Performance-wise, there is about a 4% hit when going from off to low and around 6% when stepping up to normal or high. Personally, I think low looks better overall, but if you prefer the look of normal or high, feel free to use those instead. Next, we have VFX Quality. When it comes to rain, fire, and other environmental effects, this setting doesn't seem to affect those elements at all. It merely impacts certain particles and visual effects generated by the player's actions. For example, when shooting this zombie, we can see more blood particles on standard compared to low. At first glance, the performance impact seems minimal, but there are specific visual effects that can heavily impact performance, like the particles generated when destroying these spider webs. Because of this, I recommend keeping this one at low. Lastly, let's take a look at few post-processing effects, starting with depth of field. This effect does not only appear in cutscenes, it's also noticeable during normal gameplay, especially when aiming or getting close to objects. Performance-wise, it has a small cost of around 3 to 4%. The same goes for lens dirt, which as expected also does not show any significant performance impact as you can see here. Finally, we have lens flare, which also affects bloom. And similar to the other post-processing effects, its performance impact is small, around 2% between off and high. So generally, these effects mostly come down to personal preference. If you like the added look, feel free to keep them on. If not, you can disable them without getting or losing much performance either way. So given everything we've discussed so far, these are my recommended settings for Resident Evil Requiem. Now let's compare the performance of the optimized settings against the max preset at 1440p using DLSS quality with low textures on both sides. Let's start with the no RT results. Here in this area at the beginning of the game, we can see an average performance uplift of around 28% with the optimized settings. And since we have plenty of VRAM and performance headroom here, we can actually enable hair strands as you can see here. On the max preset side, this completely fills the VRAM, yet performance remains stable, which is genuinely impressive. Switching to a less demanding indoor area, and here I switch from DLSS quality to DLAA. And even at native 1440p with the max preset fully occupying all 8GB of VRAM, the game still maintains strong and stable performance. This highlights just how efficiently this game runs. But to keep this comparison fair, let's switch to Leon. This time I am using high shadow quality instead of max on the max preset side, to keep VRAM usage under control. In this section we again see an average performance uplift of around 28%. Now let's switch to ray tracing. To use RT on this GPU, we need to drop the DLSS to balanced, and even then 60 FPS still isn't possible in this area. This is one of the most demanding spots for ray tracing with all the lights and reflections stacked together. The good news is that we still have plenty of VRAM available, so frame generation remains an option to improve overall smoothness. Moving back to the indoor area from earlier, RT performance is noticeably better here even without frame generation. So ray tracing is definitely doable on the 3060 Ti with the optimized settings, but it's only worth it if you don't mind the added noise and flickering, especially on reflective surfaces. For path tracing on the 4070 Super, we need to make the same adjustments, which means using DLSS balance at 1440p, but this time with medium textures instead of low. What's interesting here is that we get almost the same performance as the 3060 Ti with ray tracing. Frame generation also remains an option since VRAM usage is nowhere near the 12GB limit. And if we switch to Leon's section, we can still see strong performance even with all the lights, reflections, and the action happening on screen. Before ending the video, I want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon. If you are able and would like to directly support my work, consider becoming a patron to get access to the highest possible quality of my latest videos, including this one. And a big thank you to all my supporters, and thanks to you as well for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and if not, leave a dislike. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.